They forced the obese widow to marry the crippled rancher no woman would take. Neither of them expected what happened behind closed doors. The morning Nora Briggs became a wife for the second time, nobody asked her what she wanted. She had learned by then that nobody asking was its own kind of answer. 6 weeks had passed since Calvin died. 6 weeks of his family emptying the house around her. The furniture first, then the dishes, then the curtains, while she stood in rooms that grew barer by the day and said nothing because there was nothing left worth saying. 6 weeks of Grover's Bend deciding what kind of woman she was based on the kind of man Calvin had been. 6 weeks of eyes sliding past her in the street the way eyes slide past something people have already decided not to see. She had 40 cents. She had one dress without a mended hem. She had nowhere to go. When Sheriff Holt told her the arrangement, she stood very still and listened without interrupting. Wade Kane stood near the window with his hat in both hands and his face arranged into something that resembled concern. He had come to the house twice after Calvin died. His hand on her arm when he left, 1 second longer than grief required. She had filed that away and said nothing. A rancher, out on the Grover's Bend Road. His wife had left him after the accident. He needed a household managed. She needed a roof. It was, the sheriff said, practical. She said yes because yes was the only door left open. The county clerk's office smelled of pine resin and old paper. Nora sat in one chair. The other was empty when she arrived. She heard him before she saw him. The particular sound of a cane on a wooden floor, not weak, not tentative, but deliberate. The sound of a man who had decided his new terms would be his own. He came through the door and she saw him for the first time. He was not what she expected. She had heard what Grover's Bend said about Jesse Kane, that the accident had broken him, that his wife had looked at the man he'd become and ridden away without a letter, that he had closed everything worth opening. She had expected someone the years had worn to nothing. What she found instead was a man who filled a doorway. Broad through the shoulders, weathered through the face, with eyes, dark, still, watchful, that moved to her face and stayed there with the directness of someone who had stopped spending energy on pretense. He looked at her the way she had looked at him. Taking measure. Deciding. He sat down across the table. He put his cane against his knee. He looked at the clerk's ledger and then back at her and he said, quiet, flat, no cruelty but no warmth either. I didn't ask for this. Neither did I, she said. They signed their names on the same line and became husband and wife in the time it takes a clock to move from 1 minute to the next. Wade Kane drove them to the ranch. He talked the entire way about the land, the county agreements, the practical sense of the arrangement. His voice filled the buggy the way smoke fills a room. At the gate his hand found her elbow and his voice dropped low enough that Jesse ahead of them could not hear. I know this isn't easy. If you ever find yourself in need of anything, anything at all. His eyes moved over her face with a warmth that had nothing warm inside it. A man in his condition can only offer so much. You remember that? She looked at his hand on her arm until he removed it. Then she walked through the gate. The house told her everything before he said a word. Clean, orderly. The curtains faded, the floors bare, the table with one chair pulled out in the way of a man who had stopped expecting anyone to fill the other one. She put her bag down and followed the sound of his cane through the house, not because she had decided to, but because there was nowhere else to go. He was at the window when she found him, his back to her. The room behind him had one bed, one lamp, one chair in the corner. There's no other room ready, he said. To the glass. Not to her. She looked at the room. She looked at her dress, her one dress, pressed the night before with a borrowed iron. She said, "Is there something I could change into?" He turned from the window. He crossed to the chest at the foot of the bed and lifted out a folded shirt and held it toward her without making it into anything. Just what he had. She took it. She opened it and held it out and looked at it. Then she looked at him. He was already looking back, those same still dark eyes, seeing her the way very few people ever had. She held the shirt back toward him. "I can't wear it," she said. Not with embarrassment. Just a fact. He took it, set it on the chest, sat down in the corner chair without speaking. She turned toward the bed and reached behind her to loosen her collar. Her fingers found the fabric snagged, caught somewhere between her shoulder and the bedpost, pulled tight in a way she couldn't reach. She tried once, twice, her arms not finding the angle. She heard him stand. His footsteps crossed the room and stopped behind her, close enough that she felt the warmth of him in the space between them. She went still. She stood with her hands at her sides and her eyes forward and waited. His hand came to the fabric at her back, only the fabric, careful and deliberate, working the snag loose with the unhurried patience of a man who has decided to do something and is doing it. She felt the tension and release. She felt how close he was standing. She heard him breathe, slow, controlled. The fabric gave. A small sound, barely a tear, and in the same moment he stepped back. She smoothed the dress. She did not look at him. He went back to his chair. She lay down on the bed in her dress and looked at the ceiling. The lamp burned low. She heard him open his book, heard him turn a page. After a while he set it down. The lamp went lower. The room went dark. In the dark he said, "This isn't a real marriage." "I know," she said. She lay still and listened to his breathing slow across the room, and she thought about the shirt he had offered without thinking and the careful way he had stepped back the moment the fabric gave, as though he had been counting the seconds until he could. She did not name what she thought about those things. But she lay awake in the dark a long time before sleep finally came. She woke to an empty room. The chair in the corner was vacant, the blanket folded across its arm with the particular neatness of someone who had never intended to stay. The lamp was cold. Morning light came through the window in a thin gray line, and she lay still for a moment listening to the sounds of a house already moving without her, the stove being fed in the kitchen, the scrape of a chair, the particular silence of a man who has learned to take up as little space in the world as possible. She dressed quickly and went to the kitchen. He was already at the table. Plate in front of him, coffee poured, the morning organized around himself the way it had been organized around himself for a long time before she arrived. He looked up when she came in. His eyes moved over her, over the dress, the same dress, the small tear at the shoulder she had not yet mended, and then back to his plate without expression. She stood in the doorway. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have been up." "Don't." He said it flat, without looking at her. "I don't need anything done for me. I can manage myself." She looked at him for a moment. Then she went to the stove and made her own breakfast and sat at the table and ate it. Not beside him. Across from him. In the chair she had placed there herself on the first evening. He did not comment on the chair. He did not comment on anything. He finished his meal and left, and she sat alone at the table with her coffee and looked at the single plate he had washed and set back on the shelf before she had even sat down. One plate, one cup, returned to exactly where they had always been. She sat with that for a moment. Then she washed her own. 3 days later Cobb appeared at the kitchen door with a paper parcel under his arm and his hat in his hand and the expression of a man who has been given an errand he doesn't entirely understand. He set the parcel on the table without explanation and left. She stood looking at it for a moment. Then she opened it. A dress. Plain cotton, dark brown, practical. The right size in the approximate way of a man who had looked at a woman once and made a reasonable guess. She pressed her hand flat against the fabric and felt something move in her chest that she did not know what to do with. She folded it carefully and went to her room and changed and came back to the kitchen and mended the old dress by the window in the afternoon light and said nothing about any of it to anyone. Neither did he. The days settled into a shape. She cooked. She cleaned. She managed what needed managing and left alone what he had made clear was his. He moved through the house and the ranch on his own terms, refusing help so quietly and so completely that after a while she stopped offering it. Not because she had stopped wanting to, but because she understood that the offering itself was the thing he couldn't bear. Every outstretched hand looked the same to him. Every act of assistance felt like someone agreeing with what the town had already decided he was. She understood this without being told. She had spent 6 years watching Calvin be agreed with. So she kept her distance and she watched instead. The way he rode the fence line in the evenings with the cane hooked over the saddle horn. The way he came in afterward and stood at the basin washing his hands for longer than washing required, his weight on his good leg, his jaw set against whatever the ride had cost him. The way the ranch, which should have been thriving on land this good, was somehow always just managing. Supplies arriving late, contracts that didn't quite add up, decisions that seemed to have been made by someone other than the man who owned the place. She filed all of it away behind her eyes and said nothing. Wait came at the end of the first week. She heard his buggy on the road and watched from the kitchen window as he came through the gate. Well-dressed, unhurried, carrying a small parcel the way a man carries something he intends to be noticed carrying. He came to the kitchen door and knocked and smiled when she opened it. He said he just wanted to make sure she had everything she needed, that the adjustment wasn't too difficult, that Jessie could be. He paused here with the careful sympathy of a man choosing his words, challenging. She made coffee and set it in front of him and he sat at her table and talked. About the ranch. About the county agreements he was managing on Jessie's behalf. About how glad he was the arrangement had worked out. His questions arrived inside his sentences the way stones arrive inside bread. You didn't notice them until you bit down. How is Jessie sleeping? Did he seem low? Had he mentioned the supply contracts at all? She answered simply and honestly because she had no reason not to. He was Jessie's family. He had arranged all of this. He was, she thought, the one person in Grover's Bend who had actually tried to help. He always worries about Jessie, she said when Wade stood to leave. That's what you can see in him. How much he cares. She didn't notice Jessie in the hallway until after Wade's buggy had gone. He was standing there, still, watching. She didn't know how long he had been listening. He cares, she finished, softer now. His expression didn't change. For a moment, she thought he might say something. He didn't. He stepped into the room, the quiet of him sharper than before. Did he ask about the contracts? He said. The question caught her off guard. Yes, only in passing. And you told him? I didn't think it mattered. The pause. It matters, he said. Just that. He moved past her without another word. And this time, it didn't feel like distance. It felt like something closing. Outside the window, the ranch moved through its afternoon. Wind across grass. Cobb working in the barn. Everything looked the same. She picked up the coffee cups and washed them slowly. Only when she set them back did she realize. She still didn't understand what she had done. But Jessie did not look at her the same way anymore. He didn't look at her differently after that day. That was the thing she kept returning to. He didn't go cold exactly, didn't become cruel, didn't say anything that would have given her something to push back against. He simply withdrew. The way a tide withdraws. Completely, quietly, leaving the shore exactly as it was and taking something essential with it. She noticed it in small things. He stopped coming to the kitchen in the mornings before she was up. He ate earlier, alone, and was gone by the time she came in. At supper he answered if she spoke and did not speak if she didn't and looked at the window the way a man looks at something he is waiting to be over. She could not have pointed to a single thing he did wrong. She stopped trying to explain it. She started going out to the property that second week. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. She simply began walking the fence line in the mornings after he rode out, talking to Cobb about the south pasture rotation, asking the kind of questions a woman asks when she is trying to understand a place she has been put in charge of. Cobb answered her because she asked simply and directly and seemed to genuinely want to know. She listened to everything he told her and kept her own face easy and unremarkable and filed it all away. The ranch was suffering in ways that had nothing to do with Jessie's leg. She could see at once she knew what to look for. Supply agreements that renewed at prices nobody had renegotiated. Cattle contracts routed through a broker she'd never heard Jessie mention. The feed merchant in town whose numbers, when she asked to see them one morning while settling an account, seemed to exist in two slightly different versions depending on which page you looked at. She stood in that office with her hand on the open ledger, reading the columns, feeling something settle in her chest like a stone dropping to still water. She closed the ledger. She thanked the merchant. She walked back to the ranch in the afternoon heat, and she thought about Wade Kane and his careful questions and his warm, unhurried visits and the particular way he had of standing in a room like a man who considers himself its rightful center. She thought about what she had said in the kitchen. He always worries about Jesse. That's what you can see in him. She pressed her lips together and kept walking, but she didn't stop thinking about it. She asked Jesse about the sessions on a Thursday morning. She had been thinking about how to say it for 4 days, and in the end she didn't say it the way she had planned. She was at the stove and he was passing through, and she said it to his back, plainly, without turning around. I want to try something with your leg. It might not work, but it might. He stopped walking. She heard him stop. She kept her eyes on the stove. The silence stretched long enough that she thought he had decided, and the decision was no. Then he said, "After supper?" and walked out. She stood at the stove and let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. That evening she filled the clay bowl with warm water and set it on the kitchen floor and sat down beside it and waited. He came in after supper and stood in the doorway and looked at the bowl and then at her sitting on the floor, and something moved through his face that she couldn't read. He crossed the room. He sat in the chair. He reached down and took off his boot without a word and put his foot in the water. She began. She worked steadily and without rushing, the way she did everything. Her hands moved over the sole of his foot, the arch, the ankle, careful pressure, slow circles. The particular sequence she had carried in her hands since she was young without ever having used it on anyone. He sat very still. His hands rested on his knees. He looked at the wall. The lamp burned low between them, and the kitchen was so quiet she could hear the fire settling in the stove. She didn't know how long they sat like that. Long enough for the water to cool slightly. Long enough for the silence to change quality, to become less guarded, more like the silence of two people who have stopped pretending they are somewhere else. She was working the arch of his foot when he spoke. Not about his leg. Not about the ranch. He said, quietly to the wall, "Margaret left in April. 4 months after the accident. She didn't leave a note." Nora kept her hands moving. She did not look up. She did not say she was sorry or offer him the particular empty comfort people reach for when they don't know what else to give. She just kept working and let him decide whether he wanted to say more. He didn't. Not that night. But when she finished and dried his foot and stood, she picked up the bowl. At the door she stopped. She did not turn around. Same time in 2 days? The kitchen was quiet. She waited. Fine. She took the bowl outside and poured the water into the yard and stood in the dark for a moment with the empty bowl in her hands and the cool night air on her face. Something had happened in that kitchen that she didn't have words for yet. Something that felt, in the most careful and tentative way, like the first thread of something being passed from one person to another in the dark. She went back inside. Wade came again that week. He found her at the fence line talking to Cobb and walked toward her across the yard with his hat raised and his smile in place, and she felt her shoulders settle into a careful stillness before he had even reached her. He was warm. He was concerned. He asked how she was managing and whether she needed anything, and said he was always available if things became difficult. And then, as though it were simply the natural next thing to say, he added, "You don't need to worry yourself about the ranch business, Nora. The accounts, the contracts, leave all of that to me. It's not women's work, and Jesse has enough to carry without you adding to it." He said it kindly. He said it the way a man says something he believes is a favor. She looked at him. She kept her face easy and her voice pleasant, and she said she understood. He nodded, satisfied, and went to find Jesse, and she watched him go and felt something harden quietly in the center of her chest like water turning to ice. She looked back at the fence line, at the property stretched out around her. At the south pasture, Cobb had told her hadn't been properly rotated in 18 months. At the supply shed, that was short on things it shouldn't have been short on. She thought about the 2 sets of numbers in the feed merchant's ledger. She thought about Wade's voice in the kitchen 3 weeks ago. If you ever need anything, a man in his condition can only offer so much, and the way his eyes had moved over the house when he said it. Not with concern. With assessment. She stood at the fence line for a long time after he had gone inside. Then she went back to work. She didn't know yet the full shape of what she was beginning to understand. But she understood enough. And some things, once you have started to see them, cannot be unseen. The sessions settled into her days without asking permission. Every second evening, the bowl, the water, the low creak of the floor as she knelt. He came in without a word, removed his boot, lowered his foot into the warmth. She worked with steady hands. The lamp burned low between them. The stove whispered. Nothing else moved. It was here she began to notice him. Not the man the town spoke of. This one. The way his shoulders eased as the heat seeped in. His breathing changing, shallow at first, then deeper, fuller, as though for this 1 hour he allowed himself to rest inside his own body. She reached up to adjust the lamp. Her fingers caught it wrong. Her balance shifted. She tipped forward, not far, not dramatically, but her hand came down on his knee and the rest of her followed, and suddenly her face was close to his. Closer than it had ever been. She stilled. So did he. She saw it happen. That careful distance he wore like armor, not cracked, not weakened, gone. Replaced by something unguarded and searching and unmistakably real. His breath was warm against her skin. His eyes held hers with an openness that made her chest tighten without warning. His hand moved. Slowly. He covered hers where it rested on his knee. The fire shifted softly. The lamp burned on. Then she pulled back. Carefully. Deliberately. Her hand returned to the bowl. His lifted from hers and settled back on the table. The silence closed again. But it was not the same silence. Her hands were not as steady as before. His eyes, when she caught them, were no longer fixed on the wall. The honey appeared on the table one morning in the 3rd week. She almost missed it. She came into the kitchen before dawn and it was there on the corner of the table. A small jar, dark amber, no note, and she stood looking at it for a moment with her hand not quite touching it. She had mentioned it once. Not to him directly. To Cobb at the fence line, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. She had said her mother used to put honey in cornbread. One sentence. She hadn't thought anyone was listening. She picked up the jar and held it and felt something move through her chest that arrived without permission and left her standing very still at the kitchen table in the gray light of early morning. She made the cornbread. She put a piece in front of him at breakfast without saying anything. He ate it without saying anything. He looked out the window the way he always looked out the window. But when he finished, he sat for a moment longer than usual before pushing back his chair, and something in the line of his jaw was different in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone. She washed the dishes with her back to him, and she allowed herself one still moment, just one, of feeling the full weight of that small jar on the corner of the table. Then she put it away. He began talking during the sessions. Not much. Not all at once. The way a man talks when he has been quiet for so long that words come back to him slowly, like feeling coming back to something that has been numb. He talked about the ranch the way it had been before the accident. The south pasture when it was properly rotated. The cattle contracts he had built over 10 years with ranchers who respected him. The horseshoe pit behind the barn where Saturday evenings used to sound like something. He said that last part once, briefly, and then stopped. She kept her hands moving and said nothing, and he didn't say it again. She was working the arch of his foot one evening when his toes curled. Sudden. Involuntary. All 5 at once. A quick convulsive flex that lasted less than a second and then released. She felt it happen under her hands before she saw it. She kept working. She kept her voice completely level. She said, "I felt that." His hand gripped the edge of the table. She could see it in her peripheral vision, the knuckles going white, the tendons pulling taut, but she didn't look up. She kept her eyes on his foot and her hands moving, and she gave him the privacy of that moment, whatever it was doing to him, without making him share it before he was ready. He said nothing for a long time. The fire settled in the stove. The lamp burned low. Then she heard him breathe, a long, slow exhale, the kind that comes from somewhere deep, the kind a person makes when they have been holding something for a very long time without knowing they were holding it. She kept working until she was done. She dried his foot and stood. He was still looking at the wall. His eyes were dry, but the expression on his face was one she had never seen there before. Open in a way his face was almost never open, stripped of the careful distance he kept between himself and everything around him. She took the bowl and went outside. She stood in the dark for a long time. She saw him from her window that same night. She had been lying awake. She did that more often now, lying awake in the dark listening to the ranch settle into silence around her, when she heard the door. She didn't move. After a moment she turned her head and looked through the window and saw him in the yard below. He had no cane. He was standing at the fence post near the barn with both hands at his sides and his weight distributed between both legs, and he was completely still. Not moving. Just standing. Testing something she couldn't see from the window, something internal, something that had to be done in the dark where nobody could watch him try and nobody could watch him fail. She lay in the dark and watched him stand there for a long time. She didn't go out. She didn't tap on the glass. She just lay still and let him have that moment entirely to himself, the dark and the fence post and whatever it meant to be standing on both feet in secret at midnight on a ranch that was still, barely, his own. She was still awake when she heard him come back inside. She closed her eyes and lay still and felt something settle in her chest like the last piece of something finding its place, and she did not name it and she did not look at it directly. She lay there in the dark holding it carefully the way you hold something fragile that you are not yet sure belongs to you. Wade came on a Tuesday. She was in her room when she heard his buggy. Boots in the hallway. Jesse's name once. Then the footsteps came toward her room. Her door opened without a knock. He stepped inside and closed it behind him. The warmth was already gone. He crossed toward her slowly, and when he spoke his voice was barely above a whisper, the particular quietness of a man who does not need volume to make himself understood. "I know what you've been doing with his leg." She said nothing. "Stop." He held her gaze. "I am telling you once. Stop, or I will take everything he has left. Not the ranch." The pause. Him. She stood still and gave him nothing. Not fear. Not agreement. Nothing at all. He looked at her for a long time in the silence of that closed room. Long enough that the silence itself became part of what he was doing. Long enough that anyone standing outside that door would have had no way of knowing what was happening inside it and every reason to imagine the worst. Then he turned to the door. He opened it slowly. He stepped into the hallway. And there was Jesse, standing at the edge of the hall, cane in hand, jaw set. He had clearly been there for some time. Wade didn't startle. He didn't explain. He paused in the doorway and turned back toward Nora's room, toward her, and smiled. The slow, private smile of a man leaving somewhere he had every right to be. He ran one hand down the front of his coat, smoothing it, adjusted his collar, took his time. Then he looked up and saw Jesse as though noticing him for the first time. "Jesse." "Wamisi. I was looking for you, couldn't find you anywhere." A small satisfied smile still playing at the corner of his mouth. "We'll talk soon." He walked past Jesse and out the front door and down the porch steps. His buggy moved down the road and the sound of it faded into nothing. Jesse stood at the edge of the hallway. His eyes were on Nora's doorway. On the open door. On her standing inside it. His jaw was tight in a way she had never seen before, and what was in his face was not anger exactly, it was something colder and more final. The expression of a man who has just watched something he didn't know he was protecting get taken from him. He looked at her for one long moment. Then he turned and walked away in his door. She stood in her doorway and did not move. Wade had not raised his voice once. He had not accused her of anything. He had not needed to. A closed door, a long silence. A slow smile. A hand smoothing a coat. That was all it had taken, and she understood, for the first time, that nothing here was ever loud. That evening she prepared the bowl anyway and sat beside it on the kitchen floor and waited. The lamp burned. He didn't come. The second evening the same. The empty doorway. She sat until the lamp was too low to sit by and went to her room. On the third evening she heard his door. His footsteps. Coming down the hall and stopping in the kitchen doorway. She didn't look up immediately. Then she did. "I know what he did. I know what you think. I'm still here." She held his gaze and said nothing more. He stood in the doorway for a long time. Something moved in his face that she had seen before in brief flashes, in the way his jaw shifted when she put food in front of him. She had never looked at it directly. She looked at it now. He walked to the chair, sat down, reached down without speaking and took off his boot, and put his foot in the bowl. She moved the lamp between them and began. She had been collecting for weeks. Not dramatically, quietly in the margins of ordinary days. The feed merchant's second ledger copied in her own hand. Survey records from the county office. A statement from the horse trader who remembered, now that someone was asking, the man who had spent time alone near the stalls the morning before Jesse's accident. The doctor's original notes describing injuries that did not match a simple fall. She kept everything folded inside the household ledger she carried to town. She told no one. She built it the way she built everything, one piece at a time, without announcing it. She told Jesse on a Thursday evening. Not planned. Not rehearsed. She was working the arch of his foot and the kitchen was quiet and the lamp was low and it arrived the way honest things arrive. At the moment when the silence between them was the right kind of silence. "The feed merchant keeps 2 sets of numbers," she said. "I found the second set 3 weeks ago." His hands went still on his knees. "Someone has been drawing from your accounts for a long time. Someone with access." The silence that followed was the longest they had ever shared. Then Jesse said, very quietly to the wall, "He put a rattlesnake in my saddlebag." She stopped working. "The accident wasn't an accident. I've known since the second month. I have never been able to prove it." She sat with that. The full weight of it, 18 months of knowing, of watching Wade sit at his table and drink his coffee, of being too broken and too alone to fight back. "He came to my room," she said. "He told me to stop the sessions or he would destroy you." Jesse's jaw tightened. "I know what he did." The pause. Something working behind his eyes. Then, lower, quieter, "I thought it for 2 days." It cost him something to say that. She could see it costing him. She accepted it with one nod and asked nothing more and went back to the bowl. Everything now on the table between them. Nothing hidden anymore. The shape of Wade Kane fully visible to both of them for the first time, and smaller, somehow, for being finally seen. She was at the feed merchant's counter on Friday morning when Wade walked in. Behind him, the county official. The sheriff. 3 town elders. The particular stillness of men who have come somewhere to watch something happen. His face was grave. Concerned. He spoke to the room about Jesse's instability, about a woman with no credentials performing treatment on a vulnerable man, about a widow with a ruined reputation who had inserted herself into something she didn't understand. He said it all with sorrow and reluctance and the careful grief of a man who had tried everything else first. The room listened. The town always listened to Wade Kane. Nora opened her household ledger and laid the first page on the counter. "Which set of numbers would you like to discuss first?" she said. "The ones the merchant shows his customers? Or the ones in the back of his ledger with your name in the margin?" The room shifted. Page by page she laid them out. The feed merchant's accounts. The survey records. The doctor's original notes. The horse trader's statement. Each one placed on the counter without drama, without raised voice, with the same steady hands she brought to everything. Wade looked at the pages. His jaw tightened. He still had one move and he used it, turning to the room with something that resembled pity. A man alone and broken. A woman who came to him with nothing. I think we all understand what has been happening in that ranch house. The insinuation landed exactly as he intended. Nora felt the room change around her. The eyes. The weight of a town that had already decided what kind of woman she was being given permission to decide it again. She did not look away from Wade. She did not let anything cross her face. Then the whole room heard it. Boots on the boardwalk. The door opening. No cane. Just boots, slow, uneven, completely real. Jesse walked in. He crossed the room without his cane and every eye followed him, through the gathered men, past the official, past the elders, until he stopped beside Nora and stood there on his own 2 feet in front of everyone who had already buried him. Then he looked at Wade. You arranged this marriage because you thought she had no voice and no intelligence. You thought she'd tell you what I was doing and stay out of your way. He looked at the room. She found your ledger in 3 weeks. It took me 18 months. Wade opened his mouth. You put a rattlesnake in my saddlebag, Jesse said. Complete silence. The sheriff unfolded Nora's documents. He read slowly. He looked at Wade with an expression that was no longer officially neutral. Mr. Kane. Come with me. Wade looked at the faces that had always given him deference and trust and found something different. Not hostility. Distance. He picked up his hat. He composed his face. He looked at Nora once, and she gave him exactly what she had given him in that closed room. Nothing. Not triumph. Not anger. Nothing at all. He walked out. The room was quiet for a moment. Then old Cobb, who had come in for fence nails and ended up watching all of it from the back, cleared his throat and said to nobody in particular, Man walks pretty steady for someone who's supposed to be finished. One of the elders looked at the floor. Jessie stood beside her at the counter while she folded the documents back into the ledger. He watched her hands, steady as always, unhurried as always, and something moved through his face that she had seen before only in the lamplight of the kitchen during sessions. Open. Unguarded. How long have you been building that? He said quietly. Since the 3rd week. She closed the ledger. I wasn't sure what I was building. I just knew something was wrong. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said her name. Just her name, not flat, not informational, not the voice of a man reading from an arrangement he didn't choose. The way a person says the name of something that matters to them. She held his gaze. He held the door. They walked out together into the morning. They walked back to the ranch in the quiet of the morning, just the 2 of them and the road and the sound of his boots beside her. When they came through the gate he stopped. She stopped beside him. The ranch was still around them, the barn, the fence line, the cottonwood catching the light, and she felt the full weight of everything settle into her bones all at once. The weeks of collecting. Wade's closed door. The 3 evenings on the floor. All of it arriving now that it was over. She felt his hand find hers. Not reaching. Not careful. Just there. His fingers closing around hers the way a man reaches for something he has decided belongs to him. She looked down at their hands. Then up at him. He was already looking at her. Those same dark eyes, except not the same at all. Open in a way she had never seen them outside the kitchen lamplight. Unguarded. Certain. She stepped closer. His free hand came up to her face, warm, unhurried, and she closed her eyes and leaned into it and felt the careful distance he had kept between himself and the world dissolve all at once into the simple solid reality of him standing in front of her, choosing her without ceremony in the middle of an ordinary morning. He drew her in. She let him. His arms around her were not careful anymore. Not uncertain. Just real. She pressed her face against his chest and felt his heartbeat and the warmth of him. She thought about nothing at all and stayed exactly where she was. The cottonwood shifted in the breeze, a horse moved in the barn. The morning went on around them, and neither of them moved for a long time. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday evening, she told him the pit was clear. She had been working on it for 3 afternoons alone, pulling weeds, resetting the post, carrying the old horseshoes from the back of the supply shed one by one. She came to find him on the porch with his coffee and said simply, "The pit's clear." He set his cup down, went inside, came back with his hat, walked toward the barn without a word. She followed. He stood at the edge of the pit and looked at it without speaking. Then he bent and picked up a horseshoe and felt the weight of it, not learning it, remembering it, and something in his face went very still and very open at the same time. He lined up, found his balance, new balance, earned balance, the balance of a body that had learned itself again, and threw. The horseshoe arced through the cool evening air and landed clean around the post with a sound like a bell struck once in a quiet place. He turned around and smiled. Not at the horseshoe. At her. She was standing in the last light of Saturday with the whole sky going gold behind the barn, and she felt that smile reach her across everything. Across the morning nobody asked her what she wanted, across 40 cents and one dress and a gate she had walked through alone, across warm water and lamplight and a silence that had slowly learned to hold something worth holding. She smiled back. The evening settled around them. The light went from gold to gray. The horseshoe lay still around the post. And neither of them moved for a long time.